So he came to interview, I guess it was in November, December. I borrowed my wife's convertible and picked him up from the San Jose airport and purposefully drove him by on 101 by a bunch of Silicon Valley companies with big logos in neon, on this side of the road and that side of the road. Look, there's that, there's this, there's that, to try to sell him on, come on, you need to be where it's really going to happen.
That's Jay Weber, EIT's former research director. Jay, along with Marty Tannenbaum and the rest of the EIT team, were working really hard to bring the best talent to the company. Talent like Kevin Hughes, the young webmaster we heard from last episode. But one of the most coveted up-and-comers he had his eye on was Marc Andreessen. You may know Marc now as one of the most powerful venture capitalists in the world. Some members of the press have called him the godfather of Silicon Valley. At the time, in the fall of 1993, he was 22 years old and finishing his work at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in December. But there, he had already done big things. He had helped create Mosaic, the world's first freely available web browser that allowed people to view web pages that included both graphics and text. And this was what we believe was his first trip to the place he would come to rule.
And he stayed at my house. We loved that house. It was built in 1910 out of 100% redwood. It was one of the original houses in that neighborhood in Menlo Park. Easy carriage distance from the train station kind of thing in 1910.
Okay, so it was not how many tech recruits come to Silicon Valley today to interview. Marc Andreessen's first employer in Silicon Valley would not even spring for a night at the Hilton for him. Jay would say his approach was more economical, but in some ways more personal, and it worked.
We were funded by government grants. We were penny pinchers at EIT, but also I wanted to bond with him more. And I guess it worked because he agreed to come work for me and EIT.
Marc agreed to join EIT, and both parties benefited. After leaving NCSA, Marc finally landed a job where he is being treated like one of the grown-ups. He is paid an $80,000 salary and even given a brand new Mustang as a sort of signing bonus. EIT showed it could attract real star power to their little startup, and Marc could start hobnobbing with the real power brokers in tech. But first, he had to find an apartment, just like any new arrival to Silicon Valley. Let's hear from Jay Weber again, who helped Marc get settled in Palo Alto and at the new job.
I think we did find him an apartment, one of these nice little clusters of two-story buildings in Palo Alto with a pool in the center. My strategy at the time was to be more server-oriented. It's like, Marc, you did a beautiful thing with NCSA Mosaic. Now come work for me. We're going to hit hard on the server side and sell to corporations that want to put up websites. We're going to work on data integration and scalability, streamlining, and stuff like that. And he was into that at the time.
Most accounts of Marc's transition from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign to Silicon Valley have left out the fact that he started his career at EIT. You can read all about him founding Netscape and starting venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. Marc himself doesn't talk much about this time period and rarely talks to traditional media outlets anymore. We tried, but he declined to talk to us for Computer Freaks. His assistant, Margit Wenmakers, said in an email, quote, "Marc hates looking back. It's just not his thing," unquote. Still, I went out of my way to talk to everyone I could who has interacted with Marc Andreessen from this time period, both friends and enemies. You will be hearing from multiple sides of the story in the coming episodes. If it seems like I'm presenting Marc as some sort of enigma, it's because he is. More than that, his story is the archetype of many of the most powerful people in tech. A young, ruthless technologist who starts a company, makes billions, and spins his success into more power and influence. The same can be said of Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and many more from today's billionaire class. Computer Freaks friends, a lot is about to happen in a little under 2 years during this episode. We're talking roughly about the time between the fall of 1992 and the spring of 1994. During that period, Marc is heading into his senior year of college and is accepting his first job. By the end of this episode, he will barely have reached his 23rd birthday. Would Marc's career have led to the same place had Jay Weber not recruited him to EIT? Probably. But in this episode, we're going to unpack this overlooked chapter in Marc's rise to power and how it laid the groundwork for the web browser and venture capital industries we have today. This is Computer Freaks from Inc. I'm Christine Hani Dare-Bryan. Chapter 2, Marc the Shark. Let's take a few minutes to paint a picture of Marc Andreessen. Marc is figuratively and literally larger than life. Marc is incredibly tall. Press reports debate whether he is 6'4" or 6'5". The press also have written in the past about how he has one of the largest heads you have ever seen. And it's egg-shaped. But what matters most is what it's like to work with Marc. Here is how other people at EIT described him. Starting with Kathy Medich, who certainly had a feeling he was going somewhere.
The one question I remember him asking me was, "Do you think there's money in this?" And I said, "Oh, yes, there's money in this."
And then there is Alan Schiffman, who thought Marc was frankly full of himself, even though he knew that Marc was instrumental in making the Mosaic browser.
He was really cocky, but, Mosaic was pretty important. He sort of got the web of what it's for. So I guess he was more of a leader of men than a programmer. And that was one way that I measured, because I kind of was the leader of men. For such a young guy, he had a more strategic insight than most people, but he wasn't a particularly good programmer, didn't know a whole lot of stuff.
Kevin was more captivated by him.
Marc was one of those people you find that they think so quickly internally that when they talk, they almost stammer, they blurt out their words because they're always thinking further ahead than their mouth can actually move. And he knew exactly his importance in the scheme of things. To us, he seemed pretty brash, pretty energetic.
But maybe it's best to hear how Marc described his younger self in his own podcast, one of the few times he's talked publicly about this time period.
I sometimes describe myself, I was feral at this point in my life. I just, if it's always this thing, if you could rerun prior events, like with the skill set I have today, I could have navigated it much better and a bunch of things could have turned out different.
To understand who Marc was when he got to EIT on a deeper level, we need to go back to where he went to college. He had what news outlets have reported was a $6.85 an hour part-time job working at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's National Center for Supercomputing Applications. We mentioned this university in Season 1 for its previous connections, before NCSA even started, with the French internet pioneer Louis Pouzin. NCSA, as it was called, was a huge draw for aspiring computer scientists. While we weren't able to talk to Marc himself, we talked to everyone we could find who was at NCSA at the same time as Marc, as well as the other research institutions that interacted with NCSA and by default Marc. Some people were too afraid to speak about Marc on the record from that time period because of fears of retribution from him. But we found enough that we're going to tell this story with a Greek chorus of computer freaks, starting with Alex Todich, who was also a student working at NCSA when Marc was there. Here's what he had to say.
NCSA was a magical place. We got to have all the toys because this was some kind of a government-sponsored thing where they were advancing supercomputers. We had a thinking machine supercomputer. We had crates. We had really fast networking. We were living in the future at NCSA. Visualizations for scientists and all kinds of really fun stuff. It was just an amazing place.
The toys weren't just a perk for the undergraduates. there was a thriving community of professionals working at NCSA, taking advantage of a small fortune's worth of government-funded computer technology. One of those professionals who fell in the grown-up camp was Kim Stevenson.
I love being on the cutting edge of stuff. It was really amazing to work with such intelligent people who were doing things that nobody else had ever done before. So it was exciting. Working with the scientists was fun. I got exposed to all kinds of different technologies and disciplines, scientific disciplines.
Along with all the fun toys and being on the cutting edge, NCSA gave these computer freaks space to explore and be imaginative. Here's Chris Wilson, another student and teammate of Marc's at NCSA.
I think the most exciting thing about NCSA was there was a lot of freedom to go explore different ideas. Almost every other job that I've worked at, there was not at NCSA this deep focus on you must only do your product job. And that ability to explore different ideas as long as they were going to end up being useful, I think is a positive attribute that we had because we were working in academia at the time. We didn't have to go say, well, this is the bottom line. This is how we're going to get investors to fund this, or we're going to go sell this product at the end because we can do this. And I think that flexibility was a really great attribute that really gave us a lot of benefit at the beginning. I don't think we would have been able to go explore and build the web browser if we hadn't had that environment that said it's okay to explore other ideas and spend some time working on them.
The browser Chris Wilson is referring to is the Mosaic browser. Like we mentioned before, this is the thing that would put Marc on the map. But being on the map was not enough for Marc. He was also after a fortune. Years before he founded Netscape, Marc knew he wanted to start a company. Here's Ping Fu, who hired Marc during his junior year.
And one day he came to me and said, I'm thinking about going out to start a company. And his screen prompt was $.
I'm sorry, his screen prompt was $?
Unix computer or Silicon Graphics, there's a prompt. And usually by default, it's kind of a right arrow. But his was $. He changed it. And he said he wanted to start a company. And I said, well, shouldn't you start a company after you finish your college? He says, yeah, but, Bill Gates quit college to start Microsoft. I said, yeah, you need to be Bill Gates, but finish the college. That's the first person say rose is red is genius. Second person say rose is red is just copycat. And he liked that. So he did finish.
Marc thought that browsers that would let you surf Tim Berners-Lee's newly created World Wide Web, which Marc saw for the first time in 1992, would be one way to these $. But there was competition. Mosaic, which came out in January 1993, wasn't the first browser. There were a few before it that paved the way. One of them was called Midas, which was widely released in November 1992. This browser in particular caught Marc's attention. He was so excited about it that he started messaging Midas creator Tony Johnson, a physicist at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, or SLAC.
I spent probably about a year developing the Midas browser. But I think at some point I was contacted by somebody, of course, I'd never heard of, called Marc Andreessen, who was a student at CSA.
Marc saw the importance of these browsers and the foundation they were setting for the future of the web.
Well, I remember he said, yeah, I really like your browser. I'd like to collaborate with you on it. So I sent him some information. And I remember within a day, he had sent me back a reply saying, oh, yeah, this is great. We really want to work on this. But, I've looked through all your source code and I want to make the following changes. And then, he had a list of 10 things that he didn't like about the way the browser currently worked and which he wanted to change. At that time, developing this browser was not my main job. My main job was being a physicist, developing software at SLAC, and the Midas browser was sort of a part-time side project. So I remember at that time, I thought, well, that's great, but I don't have time to make all those changes. So I think I replied in some not entirely encouraging way, saying, well, that's great if you want to make those changes, but I don't really have time to work on all that right now. So yeah, maybe that wasn't the best decision I ever made in my life. Maybe I should have worked with Marc Andreessen.
With all of Marc's dreams of being like Bill Gates and the growing interest at NCSA to find a better way to take advantage of the web, NCSA's higher-ups greenlit the project that would lead to Mosaic. It wouldn't be the first web browser, but it would strive to fix some of the problems Marc saw in Midas. While we don't know what Marc was thinking, we do know that Midas, for example, did not work on Macs or PCs. Marc wanted to make a better version, so he got to work. But how Kim remembers the start of Mosaic is different from what has been said before.
There's a myth that he sat in a coffee house and discovered the World Wide Web and brought it in and did this skunkworks on his own without permission and all that kind of stuff. And that really wasn't the way it went down, at least in my memory. There was a friend of mine, we were working on a collaboration software, and the idea was real-time collaboration between scientists. I draw on the screen and you see it. Now, today, that's nothing new. It's everywhere now. But at the time, there was nothing out there like that. And that particular team was working on the software, and they were looking for a way for scientists to also share, like, papers. And one of the guys that we worked with, and it wasn't Marc, came across Tim Berners-Lee's paper on the World Wide Web. Thought it was interesting, downloaded that first textual browser and started playing with it. And he brought it to the rest of the group, and we all went, oh my gosh, this is cool. That was shortly before Christmas break, or holiday break, and everybody went home. All the students went home, the full-timers went to their families and took some time off.
But Marc Andreessen did not go home for Christmas break in December of 1992, like his colleagues.
So during that time, Marc spent some time on his own and put together a pretty good demo. It was cool. We all came back and went, hey, this is a really cool thing. Then Joseph Hardin, who was the director, thought this was something that was worth pursuing. He got funding from the National Science Foundation, and they assigned a team, Eric Bina and Marc, to build it.
Eric Bina was Marc Andreessen's partner at NCSA. He did not agree to talk to us for this podcast.
To build a full-blown releasable version. And that full-blown releasable version was released in January of 93.
That date marked the release of the first version, but NCSA had a lot of work to do because they still hadn't solved the compatibility issue. So Marc and Eric were working on Unix. Chris Wilson worked on versions for PCs. Alex and later Kim were working on versions for Mac. And there were certainly more people than the ones I just mentioned. But once they worked out the compatibility problem, Mosaic would have the techies' full attention. Computer freaks from around the world reached out at all hours to the team at NCSA with questions and some constructive feedback. Here's Alex Todich again.
Immediately, the list of what do we want to do with this grows to infinity. So we're sitting there in the basement and just kind of riffing of each other, going like, okay, let's do this, let's do this, let's do that, and all that stuff. And at the same time, it's getting more and more popular. And like, we're discovering all this stuff. We would like read some stuff online and like participate in bulletin boards. So what happens is as the Mosaic gets popular, it starts getting downloaded more and more. Suddenly you're getting bugs 24/7 because Europe starts using it. And like suddenly you're like, oh my God, you're running on adrenaline all the time because you're talking to people around the world in like real time. And it's just amazing. So this is all new to us, right? We're just discovering all this stuff. It's a rush. You're just talking to people all the time. They're asking you to do stuff. They're telling you about the terrible thing that you've done and the bugs and all that stuff.
Yeah, it was insane. I was the one on the Mac that actually posted it to the FTP server. And it didn't take very many releases for things to start to heat up. I mean, the number of releases basically was exponential. And I remember we would post it usually towards the end of the day, because it was a long day of getting things ready, getting everything packaged and stuff. We put it on the FTP server and watched the numbers spin. And it got to the point where the counter for the number of downloads was spinning so fast that you really didn't see the numbers anymore. It was pretty amazing. Yeah, it just kind of blew your minds. It was a lot of work. It was long hours. We worked 24/7.
By the fall of 1992, everybody was working long hours and facing increased demands. So tensions started to build inside NCSA, especially between the grown-ups and the students. Marc had formed a loyal group of programmers among the students, and the students, frankly, trusted Marc more than the staffers. The band of young computer freaks were already working 24 hours a day on Mosaic. Then their bosses started imposing rules that the students were not happy about.
So they started putting handcuffs on us. Like, remember I told you how we were reading bug lists all the time and responding to people? I lost access to the bug list. I was no longer allowed to read the bugs myself. It would be somebody else who would be reading the bugs and kind of giving me compiled reports of what am I supposed to be working on. They did not want another Marc. They said, your time is better used coding. You should not be reading the bug report. You just code and we'll figure out what to do.
We would have a weekly staff meeting for all of the software tools group, like 20 people or so. And the head of this would come in and he would want to just check in with everyone and want to, spend 10 minutes saying, okay, these are things I know about this week and what's important in each of your worlds. And Marc got very frustrated because there was not a firm agenda for this meeting every week, to the point where he just stopped attending. And then, of course, some of the other people stopped attending too. And I think for me, in retrospect, that was not the way I would have gone about doing that. I would have said, how can we make this more directly productive and work together to strengthen the team rather than just choose to opt out of parts of it?
As tensions continued to grow, another side of Marc came to the forefront. Remember when Marc described himself as feral? He might have been referring to his temper. This is how Chris Hauk, who worked with Marc at NCSA, describes it.
We would go out to bars, and Champaign was 2 hours south of Chicago, so we'd always have great blues bands coming through. He's tall and imposing, and there were a couple times where it seemed like he was kind of itching for a fight, and that he was very close to, and he had enough drinks that he was willing to kind of start a fight with someone. And so I would kind of push him off to the side and we'd cool down and stuff like that.
Kim Stevenson also recalled Marc's temper.
There was one time, now, the building that we were in was made of cinder block, and the offices were fairly small, and we shared them. And Marc got frustrated with something, and I have no idea what it was. Somebody posted something that he didn't like or something like that. He got angry, and he took the telephone off of his desk and smashed it into the cinder block wall until it broke. And they had to get him a new one. I wasn't there. I did not see it personally, but I did hear about it. Yeah, that was Marc.
In Marc's defense, Alex says that emotions ran high for everyone on the NCSA team. I mean, they were working day and night on what they thought was world-changing technology.
Oh, he might have done that, but I punched a hole in the wall. It was intense.
Something had to give. So when Marc graduated, he left NCSA instead of staying on the team and continuing to build Mosaic. It was time for him to move on. But as we will get into this more later, it took Marc a long time to move on from what happened at NCSA. And in fact, arguably, he has not even moved on to this day.
It was heart-wrenching for him to leave. It was so hard. It was like a weird time because when Marc left, basically the spirit of the original group took a nosedive. And from that point on, Marc basically released the Mosaic 2.0, which was a great release, and left. And then our job was basically to catch up to where he was. So that's what I did and what the Windows team did. But you could see that the whole spirit was changing. The grown-ups were in charge, and they were going to figure out how to do all that. I mean, just designing a spinning icon was like a meeting among management kind of deal.
Marc just needed the right opportunity to bring him to Silicon Valley, the center of the tech world. And that opportunity, as we know, was EIT. Back to Marc's journey west after a quick break. Before we get back to Marc's start at EIT, let's check in with Kevin Hughes, who, as you'll remember from the last episode, was also recruited by EIT around the same time as Marc. Kevin, unlike Marc, did not have a grand plan to become the next Bill Gates. He was frankly a kid who made a great dinosaur website for his community college.
I hadn't even graduated from anywhere yet. I was 22 years old and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life.
But Kevin knew he liked computers and thought EIT was an opportunity to work with some truly incredible people.
I'd never met other people like this in my life before. These were people that thought about problems in ways that most people didn't, where they could draw from a large variety of life experiences and new technologies in order to solve particular problems.
Kevin had split his childhood between Hawaii and California, so it wasn't a complete culture shock coming to Silicon Valley. But he did tell me it took some adjusting, and he made it work by seeking some places near his home that provided comfort and community.
The thing I loved about Palo Alto is you had places like the church down the street. They would have public events that they would just invite everyone to. You could read about in the local paper, Palo Alto Weekly. And you would hear about concerts being held at the church.
Remember, music is a big part of Kevin's life. He plays guitar and writes songs.
And that's where I went to the concert by Roy Eaton playing Chopin, which I loved. Absolutely. I took the CD he was selling there and played it constantly in the car everywhere I went for the next few years.
And like any computer freak, Kevin found a good, cheap place to eat, not too far from the office. No, not Chinese food like you'd expect if you've listened to season 1. This was a diner that me and my producer Josh visited when we were in California last spring. We had lunch at the Palo Alto Creamery. I have to blame Josh. We did not get to stay for ice cream.
That's great. What'd you guys get?
We need a season 3 to go back and have ice cream.
Isn't that a great place?
It is great.
Palo Alto used to be full of places like this. That just gives you one sense of what old school Palo Alto used to be like. And it was about half of the place was like that when I got there.
Palo Alto Creamery, or the Peninsula Creamery, which is the official name of the diner, is an old school diner out of a movie set. It has high-backed booths, a steady clatter of plates of French toast and grilled cheese sandwiches being delivered to customers, and a quiet hum of diners munching happily on platters of comfort food. It's across the street from Manobu now, the perfect encapsulation of the remnants of old Palo Alto, intersecting with massive amounts of wealth. The creamery wasn't just where Kevin and the EIT gang would grab a quick bite. It was the unlikely site of some of the most consequential meetings in Silicon Valley at the time. Tell me about your meeting with Marc Andreessen there.
So we were working on the project on Secure Mosaic, and one night after doing some work on this, he said, "Hey, you want to get some dinner? I want to talk to you about some things." So we ended up having dinner at Peninsula Creamery, and he described what he wanted to do.
Actually, let's put a pin in that story. Let's go back to Marc and the start of his time at EIT. Back at EIT, Jay had a very clear idea of what he wanted Marc to work on.
We were interested in getting more into commercial products rather than research. And so I guess Alan and Marty and I thought that a commercial web server would be a potential product, and having Marc on the team would be a coup. We expected him to be interested in doing a fair amount of programming on it. He ended up not being interested much in programming at that point.
Marc appeared to be more interested in thinking about the big picture, not working on day-to-day, entry-level programmer tasks, despite being a new employee, fresh out of college.
Marc was focused on how to make things secure and why. And he was someone that, because that was the project, we had interesting discussions about that because he was thinking about future use cases.
This is Jason Blooming, Marc's office mate at EIT.
And so we had talked even then about what if part of a page was secure, what if all of a page was secure, how to avoid people. But like this whole concept of what it meant, we had some very interesting early conversations about what this could mean. How would you shop? How would you envision? How would you, do real commerce on the net? And if you can imagine these building blocks coming together, there were rich conversations about what it would mean. What was always interesting was the debate about the side discussions, if you will, about the first step. Because imagine, at the time, not everyone has a browser. So how do you get them to have a browser?
Nearly everyone at EIT could see there was something special about Marc's vision. That's at least how Kevin Hughes remembers it.
By that point, I had been working at EIT for a few months, and I got to meet and know a lot of the people there. People who came from Stanford with Stanford degrees in semiconductor technology or had masters in artificial intelligence. And they could talk for days about any of these topics in great depth, and who thought so quickly that when they talked, they were almost like spitting, like they were thinking a million miles a second. And when I first met Marc, I had no idea what it would be like. He was kind of tall, and the way he spoke, it was like he thought a million miles a second in a way that he was almost spitting, but he was so glib about everything. He'd always make a joke about everything, or he'd have a little laugh about everything.
This is where the reporting about Marc Andreessen reminds me a bit of JCR Licklider in season 1. Marc looked at how technology would work in terms of decades and generations, while most of his contemporaries were focused on the near term.
I remember very vividly, we were both working late at night, and he was in the office next to mine. And I'd go in there, and it was a small square room. And then shoved in the back in the corner was a good knee to thigh high stack of tech books, which had things like the Steve Jobs, early unofficial Steve Jobs biography at the time, and other user interface books and so on. I remember him idolizing Steve Jobs. And he was there just in the dark, looking at the screen. And he was showing me all the different websites that he was going to. And I thought, wow, it's like he's using the web as this kind of TV, as entertainment. It was the first time I'd seen anyone do that, because I couldn't do this from my house. I had a black and white Mac laptop with a trackpad and super slow modem access. Even if I had a web browser on my Mac that could display these things, it couldn't load all that content that quickly. Not the way we could at work, because we had a fast connection and these workstation class computers. And I saw what he was doing was really a new form of entertainment. It's what we call web browsing today.
And Marc quickly distanced himself from his colleagues who did not share his vision, starting with the company picture.
And initially, we didn't see him that much when we took the very first group picture of EIT. But I mention that not just for that, but because Marc didn't show up that day. He was there and everyone was really hoping he would show up, but he didn't show up. Of course, we know why, because he was trying to recruit and go back, get all the NCSA guys. He was not aiming to be there for very long.
The plan Kevin is referring to was to start a company. Marc had talked about wanting to follow in the footsteps of icons like Bill Gates since he started college. He wanted to start a business that changed the world and made lots of money along the way. But he couldn't do it alone, which is why he invited Kevin out to dinner at the Palo Alto Creamery that night in early 1994. The new company Marc was forming was, of course, Netscape. If you were old enough, you probably used the Netscape Navigator browser. Netscape would become one of the most important tech companies in the 1990s and help spark the exponential increase in tech company investment still going on today. But we'll unpack that more in a future episode. Right now, Marc was just at the start of realizing his Bill Gates fantasy, and the man partnering with him to achieve this was Jim Clark. Just the fact that 22-year-old Marc was already rubbing shoulders with Jim Clark was impressive. Here's what Marc's office mate, Jason Blooming, remembers about that.
At the end of the day, I have no idea how he was so connected so quickly. Marc was internet famous, obviously, when he came out, but the number of us that knew that were probably very small. But Marc came to the Valley, and the Valley did what it did in terms of he was connected, he was meeting with people, because this is outside of EIT. He was having these meetings about next steps. And, we've been there less than a year. I was super naive at the time, to be honest. I didn't know, my dad was a corporate attorney, and I'm like, but we have a non-compete. How could you even talk to people? And it was just, I was a bit of a Boy Scout. And Marc was like, no, this guy knows, and he has the right people, and he has this, and we could do that.
Clark was already one of the most successful men in tech. He had started Silicon Graphics, which was behind all of those amazing special effects you may have seen in movies like Jurassic Park and Terminator 2. Jim, who was 27 years older than Marc, had recently left Silicon Graphics and was looking for his next adventure. The elder Jim and the younger Marc hit it off like a house on fire.
Marc told me, at least at the time, that he'd met this guy and they wanted to actually really go big, and they were thinking about commercializing browsers. And it was an interesting idea. Jim was, I think, running SGI at the time. So very, very well-established guy. And Marc is having these conversations and just automatically networking with people. And so that ability to get people thinking in the future, I think, was definitely a superpower.
Marc had found a partner in Jim Clark, and they were ready to launch what ultimately became Netscape. So they started recruiting. They brought over Marc's colleagues from NCSA, who'd helped build Mosaic, like Eric Bina, Alex Todich, and Chris Hauk. Alex said that since Marc had left, it felt like NCSA was missing its soul. You might notice here, it was the students who were recruited and not the professional employees of NCSA, like Kim Stevenson.
Most of the full-timers were never offered. There was a bit of a chasm between Marc and Joseph Harden. Marc thought he owned the project and could drive it any way which he wanted to. And Joseph had ideas of his own. Joseph was a very smart man. The NCSA put a lot in promoting it. National Science Foundation put a lot in promoting it. If you agreed with Joseph, in Marc's mind, you didn't agree with Marc. So those of us who supported the fact that there was more than just Marc in the program didn't get invited to go. So the majority of the people that went were the students. These were the guys that worked at night and hung out together. They went out, outside of work together. Those of us who were full-time pretty much, we had our lives and we worked long hours, but we didn't necessarily hang out with them as much.
That was the case with Joseph Harden, the head of NCA's software development group. He was essentially Marc's boss, above Kim Stevenson and Ping Fu. So did you ever think of going to Netscape?
I would not have been invited.
Why would you have not been invited?
Marc and I really, in the end, didn't hit it off. We had so different ideas of how things should go and why we were doing this, and that we really went our different ways. Remember, I was the boss. I was the guy who was either slowing things down at times or making unreasonable requests.
I don't know if Marc's approach to recruiting was tinged by a lack of respect for authority or outright hostility towards those he felt were slowing him down. But he certainly didn't leave on good terms with his bosses at NCSA or EIT. Within months of arriving at EIT, he was actively trying to poach Kevin, as we know. Marc and Jim Clark would even start to compete with EIT to acquire some of the same star tech talent. And it turns out that EIT would have trouble keeping up with Netscape. One of those star recruits was Lou Montulli. Lou was known among the computer freaks as one of the developers of another early browser, Lynx, that came out of the University of Kansas. You may have never heard of Lynx, but I'm sure you've heard of cookies. You know, the stuff you accept or decline every time you open a web page. He invented them.
The choice was pretty obvious, right? To go work on the technology that we had invented and to make it a commercially viable product and bring it to millions of people is way more exciting than any other opportunities that were presented.
EIT was also pursuing Lou, but he told us he never considered them as an option to begin with.
I liked what they were doing. It was a good, grand idea, but I also didn't get the impression that they would be ultimately successful at what they were doing because they were trying to be a little bit too far ahead of the technology curve.
Can you even explain why they were too far ahead?
Yeah, this was a really long time ago, so I don't want to speak authoritatively about something that I have very little memory about. But I came away thinking that what they were trying to do would be, if they were able to make it work at all, it would be very, very slow. Slow is the death of technology. Things need to be, I mean, it's still true today, obviously. Things need to be responsive and fast and feel like something you really want to use. Nobody wants to use slow software. And again, when you're way ahead of the technology curve, it's hard to be fast. A lot of technologies have gone to that graveyard just because the hardware and software wasn't fast enough to work, or the network, as well.
EIT wasn't moving quickly enough for Lou, and it sure as hell was too slow for Marc. EIT knew it. Here's how Marty Tannenbaum remembers Marc at that time.
Marc was similar to a few other people I've known at his career stage. Marc was intense. He knew what he wanted. I don't think EIT was able to move fast enough for him.
Well, how did you feel about the fact that he was recruiting people for the new company at the Palo Alto Creamery just down the street from your office?
I think we actually sent him a letter to cease and desist. He not only was trying to hire our employees, but people that we made offers to. And he tried to get Kevin Hughes to go with him.
This was just the start of the rivalry between EIT and Netscape, and EIT was losing. But would Kevin also decide to go with Marc?
And at some point, I got another email. It was for a meeting to meet Jim Clark and some of the other SGI Silicon Graphics folks at Cafe Verona in downtown Palo Alto. So I just ended up going there. That's where I met Jim Clark and some of the other guys. And this was, again, a completely new experience for me. I hadn't met another technology executive in this world, much less a really well-known one. I don't know their names, but I believe they were some of the engineers, SGI engineers. And so Jim took his pick of the top engineers he wanted from SGI, while Marc took basically all of the NCSA guys that were working on anything having to do with the browser, recruited them, along with Lou, who EIT was recruiting at the time, Lou Montulli. So you had this early mix. And then there was me. I was the only person that had been working at EIT, albeit for a few months, that he asked. Because, again, of all the people that they knew, they didn't know any graphic designers. They didn't know anyone who had any experience with any design tools or worked in this realm. The NCSA guys knew how to put together a website, but not necessarily the SGI guys. So they asked me. And in that context, that was what Jim talked to me about. And Jim Clark was kind of intimidating. I mean, despite him being a very hardcore engineer himself, despite having an engineering upbringing And despite having him always root for the engineers versus the executives, I didn't know that at the time. And to me, he came across as kind of a big-time executives and throwing around words like stock options and equity and And I didn't understand anything about this world. Even the options I was offered at EIT, I had no idea what these numbers meant or what the paperwork meant or what it could lead to or how it could affect my life or why I was even offered this in the first place.
This naivete from Kevin would definitely hurt him later in his life. But for now, it just meant that he gave an answer not many gave to Marc and Jim.
And Kevin said no. And I think it was largely on, Kevin was, just a really genuine person with loyalties. And he thought this was wrong and decided not to go.
Marty would keep Kevin at EIT. And for that, Marty would try and repay Kevin for that loyalty in the bumpy years to come. But we'll talk more about how well that worked out in future episodes. How would you compare Kevin and Marc as people you both hired and mentored?
Completely different. Kevin came from Hawaii. I'm waving my fingers in like a hang loose. He makes music, he makes art. He's a creative, just a kind spirit. And Marc was in a hurry to get stuff done.
In the end, though, Marc didn't really need Kevin's loyalty, kindness, and even talent. Marc may have burned bridges both at NCSA and EIT, but he had his partner in Jim Clark, all the talent he wanted, minus Kevin, and the drive to succeed at all costs. Marc was a shark. Marty, Kevin, and the rest of EIT were not. What comes next is that Marc is about to start on the path to power that he has now, and EIT falls into obscurity. More on Marc's rise to power in next week's episode. Computer Freaks is created and hosted by myself, Christine Hani Dare-Bryan. Our executive producer and editor is Josh Christensen. Producers are Miriam Kiparawidze and Taka Zen. Production support from Blake Odom, Matt Toder, and Avery Miles. Music by James Jackman. Sound design and mixing by Nicholas Torres. Fact-checking by Mark Amundsen. Special thanks to Stephanie Mehta, Mike Hoffman, and Michelle Legro. And I dedicate Computer Freaks Season 2 to my dad, Major Joseph Hani.